제17회 제주 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 지금부터 핵전쟁 예방을 위한 위기관리 방안, 쿠바 미사일 위기가 오늘날 우리에게 주는 교훈은 무엇인가? 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 본 행사는 동시통역이 제공되며 통역을 원하시는 분들께서는 자리에 놓여 있는 수신기를 착용하시기 바랍니다. 한국어 채널은 1번, 영어는 2번입니다. 감사합니다. 세션의 진행을 맡아주실 좌장님을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 좌장님은 김숙 전 유엔 대사님입니다. 김숙 대사님께서는 2011년부터 2년간 주 유엔 대사로 재직하며 한국의 유엔 안보리 비상임이사국 진출 캠페인을 성공적으로 완수하셨습니다. 현재는 보다 나은 미래를 위한 반기문재단의 상임이사로 재직 중이십니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 17th Jeju Forum. Thank you for joining us today for Preventing Nuclear War Through Crisis Management, What We Can Learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis Today. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. For service in Korean, set your device on channel 1. For English, select channel 2. Now, I would like to hand over the stage to the former Ambassador Kim, who will moderate this session. Everyone, please welcome the moderator.
감사합니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.
Our session. My name is Kim Suk, as just been introduced. As a moderator, before we begin, I'm obliged to announce and recognize the presence of 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon. We are very much honored to have him here. Yes. He has a very tight schedule, so I ask him to feel free to leave anytime your schedule requires. And our topic today is preventing nuclear war through crisis management, trying to draw lessons from the Cuban missile crisis. On February 27th this year, 3 days after Russian troops invaded Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that he had taken the unprecedented step of ordering Russia's nuclear warhead to be prepared for so-called special combat preparedness. And on April 25th, North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un said in a speech that North Korea has 2 missions for nuclear forces, with the second mission indirectly suggested as preemptive nuclear strike being aside from the least first one of deterring and preventing a war. This second mission of the nuclear forces was elaborated more in detail on September 9th, only last week, when Kim Jong-un proclaimed in a defiant speech at a Supreme People's Assembly meeting in Pyongyang with an introduction of the new law on North Korea's nuclear power policy. He listed 5 conditions to use nuclear weapons, one of being very dangerously imminent and suspiciously prominent is that the sign of imminent attack as the condition of using nuclear weapons against whoever enemy they name. These may be 2 recent cases that the use of nuclear weapons is not only conceivable in theory, but also practically possible on the field when either in Ukraine or in Korean Peninsula, people should live under the threat of nuclear weapons. No one in the world can declare that they are safe from the nuclear specter. and furthering our own disappointment and worries, only 3 weeks ago in New York, NPT review conference concluded without the adoption of the final document, apparently due to Russian objection to the language surrounding Ukrainian situation. This is an era where crisis management surrounding nuclear weapons is all the more important than ever. So what should we do? Is there any lesson from the past, from the Cold War era? 60 years ago, the United States and the Soviet Union overcame the Cuban Missile Crisis through peaceful negotiation, narrowly avoiding a nuclear war, realizing that the use of nuclear weapons would eventually lead to the annihilation of humanity. We need to rethink on how to draw lessons, the right lessons from that crisis that can be usefully applied to the situation 60 years later. This is the subject for discussion this morning, Cuban Missile Crisis at 60. Now, let me introduce 5 participants here. 2 are the speakers and 3 discussants. 2 speakers will join us virtually, and 1 speaker has been connected, and the other one has some technical problem because he is trying to connect with us from Rome. So we'll see what happens if he could get into our session. But our first speaker is Professor Lee Gun-uk, Sogang University. He has been teaching international relations since 2004. He's joining us virtually. And the second one, who we are trying to connect, is Dr. Mariana Bujarin, a senior research associate at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfast Center. At the center, she is in charge of the project on managing the atom. From the technicians back there, is she online? Not yet? Okay, we'll see what happens. And we have 3 discussions on the podium. Next to me is Dr. Shatavisha Shetty, Executive Director, Asian Pacific Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, APLN. She served at the European Leadership Network for 10 years before joining APLN. Even though APLN is headquartered in Seoul, she came all the way from Australia, right? Yeah, I'll call you Shata. Yeah. And next is Dr. John Wolfstall, Senior Advisor to Global Zero. And he's also a member of Science and Security Board at the Bulletin of the Atomic Science. You know, Bulletin of the Atomic Science is famous to make annual announcement of doomsday clock. And the Secretary General was there a couple of years ago to announce the new clock setting at that time. He used to serve in the National Security Council of the Obama administration as Senior Director for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. She has been engaged in this nuclear affairs since as long as 30 years when there was the first nuclear crisis with North Korea. And the Dr. Alec Chung, Dr. Jong Seung-chul, Research Fellow, Jeju Research Institute. He studied at the University of Florida. His area of specialty is peace and conflict in East Asia, and China-Japan ROK relations, among other things. Thank you, 3 participants here joining us here. Now we start our session beginning with Professor Lee Gun-uk on Cuban Missile Crisis at 60. Are you ready? Please go ahead. You have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Yeah, let me introduce once again myself. My name is Lee Gun-uk, and I'm a professor at Seogang University. At Seogang, I have been in charge of international relations and the security affairs classes since 2004. Welcome to the 21st century, because I'm saying this because I'm at the other side of this planet. I'm on the sabbatical leave, and I'm here, online from the Washington, D.C. area. It's my great honor to participate in this prestigious event. In particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Hanin Tag and the JPI Jeju Peace Institute for this wonderful forum and for giving me a chance to be part of it. Today's topic is of great significance to the real world, in that democracies all over the world are faced with revisionist challenges from authoritarian regimes. Main theme of Jeju Forum, Beyond the Conflict Toward Peace, is highly relevant too, but in my opinion, it lacks an important element: crisis management, the very topic that today's session is based upon. Let me give you two stories. The first one ended with tragedy. In 1914, the world failed to put things under control and tragically fought a great war. In this respect, the First World War, unlike the Second World War, was an unnecessary war, which started as a failure in crisis management. On the other hand, in 1962, as Ambassador Kim Suk mentioned, Washington and Moscow showed mutual restraint and successfully controlled the situation. The world survived due to the successful crisis management. What I'm trying to say here is, to go beyond the conflict, we need to learn how to put things under control. Crisis management is crucial. So what kind of lessons do we learn from the past experience, in particular from the Cuban Missile Crisis? This is the issue that I'm going to address today. Okay, let's go back to 60 years ago, September 15, 1962. The Soviet deployed 60 ballistic missiles that could reach continental United States from Cuba, and 160 nuclear warheads in the island. But Americans did know nothing. At that time, the U-2 overflight had been canceled for weather conditions, and the United States had no way to figure out what was going on in the island. In October 1962, a month later, John F. Kennedy, JFK, came to know John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, came to know about the Soviet nuclear deployment from the air reconnaissance, reacted with blockading Cuba. It was the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everybody knows that the Cuban Missile Crisis, was a happy ending. However, it was not programmed. It was not destined to be in that happy way. If things went wrong, the world must have been devastated. JFK mentioned 70 million killed, while Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at that time, talked about 200 million and plus killed. In the US war plan, the PSYOP 62, Single Integrated Operation Plan 1962, Washington was supposed to attack not only the Soviet Union, but also Cuba, but also China, and to kill additional 100 billions too. It might have been the end of civilization as we know. Luckily, the world survived. The critical question is how? How did United States and the Soviet Union get out of a nuclear war? First, United States and the Soviet Union, both of them restrained themselves at the same time rather than push the other side into conditional surrender. The US decided to withdraw its missiles out of Turkey, while Soviet Union chose to pull their missiles out of Cuba. Both of them was cautious, but they did show no desperate effort to blow up everything. And they talked with each other. Communication was crucial, especially in case of crisis. Both of them, Soviet Union and the United States, signaled their capabilities and credibility. And also, they behaved like professionals. They chose not to declare victory at the political sacrifice of the other. In this respect, they tried to keep things nothing personal, but strictly business. Those communication, sometimes explicit communication, sometimes tacit communication, they had a gentleman's agreement. All of these things made a huge contribution to a successful crisis management. At the last moment, when things began to fall apart, Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, and then at that time he was the Secretary of Justice, paid a secret visit to Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States. Robert Kennedy said that, okay, we are going to invade the island tomorrow morning, and you should do something right now. This warning might have been worked to push Moscow into a famous use it or lose it dilemma, and provoke the Soviets into firing first against the Americans, rather than waiting for the Americans to conduct an amphibious attack against the island. Miraculously, Robert Kennedy's message worked, and it worked in a good way. At that time, Washington and Moscow found themselves on the edge of use it or lose it dilemma on the one hand, and getting out of themselves unharmed on the other. Both choose to risk security for peace, found ways to betray the deadly doomsday logic. They survived, and the civilization was spared. Unfortunately, in these days, things are different. United States has been committing to support Taiwan's vibrant democracy in an unwavering way. But recent high-profile visits by the American politicians are not only election motivated, but also dangerous in undermining the delicate stability over Taiwan. As a status quo power, United States can maximize its interest in East Asia by doing nothing and keeping things as they have been. This is a wonderful equilibrium. In this respect, however, Pelosi's visit is not only unnecessary, but also provocative. Most of all, it presents China a chance to declare its ambition over Taiwan, which Beijing has been repeating over and over again, and also to repeat its challenges in more open and in a more aggressive way. We might want to justify Pelosi's visit and argue that she aimed to escalate the situation to de-escalate. However, Pelosi simply escalated, and it is the job of the two presidents, Biden and Xi, to de-escalate, though they are also domestically motivated, and they do not talk with each other, tacitly or explicitly. China conducted the so-called missile test over the Taiwan, as this picture shows, and the United States demonstrated its willingness to intervene in case of a contingency. Things are not good, and perhaps the two leaders should talk through personal channels, just like JFK and Khrushchev did through his brother and Anthony Dobrynin in October 1962, and probably they should stop building more commitments. And all of these commitments are domestically and election and politically motivated. Such as deplorable, but not simply unique. In our case, last presidential election, for example, two major candidates argued over the military options to deter North Korea. The conservative candidate who won the election and became the president, Yoon Suk-yeol, argued for the kill chain, which is a preemptive option. Since it is a preemptive strike, the kill chain is by nature dangerous, might put things into a use it or lose it dilemma. Alternative is deterrence. Kind of the deterrence, very classical deterrence, deterrence by punishment, which has been much safer in controlling crisis and proved effective during the Cold War. However, the debate was politically contaminated and the logical analysis were replaced with a political slogan, unfortunately. Deterrence. It's an old concept, but it failed to be fully understood and elaborated. Deterrence is mostly about preventing a full-scale war and or about uncertainty. Its core concept, its core idea is that threat that leaves something to chance. Provocations, however, small, well-controlled use of armed forces against the adversaries, are difficult to deter since the amount of violence is well-managed, well-designed to be below the threshold to activate the deterrence idea. Another thing is this. After 3 decades of frustrations by the liberals as well as by the conservatives, our case public right now, in my opinion, is tilting toward independent nuclear deterrence. The critical question is whether we can expect peace and stability over once we build independent nuclear deterrence. Unfortunately, however, it is not likely. Theoretical predictions from the stability-instability paradox and the real-world experience from India and the Pakistan conflict provide a pessimistic story. Though nuclear-armed, India failed to deter Pakistan's provocations. Pakistan conducted a series of minor provocations behind its own nuclear shield. The irony is that strategic stability of nuclear weapons enabled revisionists, such as Pakistan, to provoke and challenge, leading to tactical instability on the ground. So we have to expect more and more crises and provocations since North Korea has built nuclear weapons, and as Ambassador Kim said in his introduction, and to come in Korean Peninsula, we have to get prepared for more and more crises and provocations. Nuclear weapon is not a wand. It's not a Harry Potter story. There is no nuclear wand that Harry Potter can use, even against his arch enemy Voldemort. In the real world, optimal mix of conventional and nuclear forces is crucial. Being outmatched in numerical and material balance by India, Pakistan resorted to nuclear threat with its overwhelming capability. Even with the nukes, India, Pakistan cannot feel secure. And the leaders should be cautious in initiating and containing, controlling crisis. Once again, we are going to see more and more crises to come. Nuclear weapons cannot be the silver bullet that kills everything. We will be faced with more issues, and leaders should learn how to handle crises and how to survive them. In 1962, KK, Kennedy, and Khrushchev restrained themselves out of cornering their adversaries. In contrast, Xi Jinping of China, Vladimir Putin of Russia, and Kim Jong-un of North Korea failed to demonstrate such self-restraint. I don't expect them to be that wise. What is deplorable, in my opinion, is that the American and ROK leaders also lack such prudence. Getting adversaries into a corner is simple, politically tempting, and popularistically convenient. However, it is stupid, dangerous, and sometimes suicidal. Leaders should be cautious. They should be careful in controlling crises. We should not be that confident. As William Shakespeare wrote in Henry V, the smallest worm will turn being trodden upon. It is more important when our worms are nuclear armed. Yes. We should punish and we should retaliate our adversaries when they provoke. What matters is that we should do in a controlled and well-designed way. In this respect, let me repeat, prevention is dangerous. Yes, it's correct. Spare the rod and spoil the child. However, sometimes the kids might go wild and uncontrollable. Trust me, I have a teenager. I know about kids. Nobody wants to see them go crazy and unstoppable. Do not over-escalate. Do not overuse violence. Be cautious. Behave like a parent. Be a grown man. Learn lessons from the past, tragic failures of the Great War, and lucky success from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Perhaps it is the most important lesson that we should learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis in order to go beyond conflict and toward peace, the main theme of the Jeju Forum this year. We need to survive crisis, and then maybe we will have a chance to go beyond the conflict and toward peace. Thanks for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee Gun-wook, for your excellent presentation. And you gave us several points that is quite well received, especially personally for me. Well, it still feels horrible that after 60 years, he just reminded us that if it had not been negotiated and resolved peacefully, the Cuban Missile Crisis could have costed as many as 100 million human lives at the time. This is horrible. And you also said of the mutual principle, not unilateral one, which remind us at the height of the Cold War era, so-called MAD principle, mutually assured destruction, dominated the U.S.-Soviet competition and war strategy as well. Professor Lee also mentioned about kill chain from the South Korean side, as well as preemptive strike, newly clarified by Kim Jong-un in the north. This also was explained by him that nuclear weapons could not be a magic wand. It cannot solve the problem. It only exacerbate and deteriorate the situation. And he suggested the wisdom of mutual missile withdrawal drawn from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and don't overreact or do not over-escalate is one of the wisdoms that we should take from it. And Henry Kissinger recently mentioned of the value of the wisdom of balanced dissatisfaction. That means the mutual concession, the balanced concession from the parties concerned. I think we should get some lesson and wisdom from that. And we were expecting the second presentation by Mariana Buzerin, but due to some technical problem for connecting with the Rome where she is now traveling, I think at the moment we are not unable to invite her to the screen. So we're going to the discussion from the floor, and we have three discussants here, and I will give the floor to first Executive Director Shata Vishashetty from APLN. Shata.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador. As a reminder, my name is Shata Shetty. I'm the Executive Director of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we are a network of former, serving, and emerging political, military, and diplomatic figures from across the Asia-Pacific region working on trying to reduce nuclear risks and eliminate nuclear weapons. So firstly, thank you to the Jeju Peace Institute and Jeju Forum and Dr. Han Entek for inviting me here today. Thank you to Professor Lee for an excellent presentation. It's certainly timely, critical, and thought-provoking. And it remains incumbent on us and instructive to reflect on what we can still learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years later. It continues to stand as a seminal event in the nuclear age and the most dangerous moment in our history. I, like I'm sure many of you, have studied the Cuban Missile Crisis during my studies, and there are still lessons that I and many others can continue to draw from it as we continue our work in politics, diplomacy, and policy. Professor Lee gave us his assessment of the crisis and the circumstances that allowed both the US and the Soviet Union to step back from the nuclear brink, as well as lessons for current times and contemporary conflicts. His conclusions, in my view, are very sensible, and apologies to him in advance for the brevity in summarizing, but that we should not corner our adversaries, that we should be proportionate in our responses, and that we should respond when necessary, but exercise restraint. All sounds simple, all sounds sensible. The challenge is that governments and states are not monolithic and rational. There are many actors, influences, and factors that impact decision-making processes, as I'm sure that John and Ambassador Kim could attest to. Nonetheless, I still very much agree with his points. Professor Buzerin, if we get to hear her presentation, will conclude that the consequences thus far of the war in Ukraine is that it promotes nuclear deterrence, undermines restraint, and challenges global nuclear governance. Time will tell where the war in Ukraine will end up, with the sincere hope that it won't escalate further. But we see that the Cuban Missile Crisis had a profound impact on President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, and this helped to lay the groundwork for early arms control agreements, such as the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, the signing and ratification of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 and 1970, followed by a period of détente, which saw further arms control measures, such as the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty talks, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and interim agreement capping the number of ICBMs that each side could develop. There were many terrifying instances of accidents and incidents during the Cold War, and mechanisms for avoiding and managing these were devised during that time, some of which are still in force today, such as incidents at sea agreements. But sadly, many of these Cold War agreements have now fallen away and no longer in force, such as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the INF Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and even the New START Treaty, the last remaining major nuclear arms control agreement in force between the United States and Russia, will end in 2026 and needs to be replaced. So all of this points towards renewed efforts to work harder to reduce 21st century nuclear risks, to enhance crisis management measures, and ensure that nuclear weapons will never be used. In listening and thinking about the presentation and the Cuban Missile Crisis, this has provoked a number of thoughts and questions from me. First, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a very specific moment in our history because nuclear war seemed imminent and very real. Are we in a similar situation today? Second, in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, is nuclear disarmament even possible? And third, how do we manage crisis management and crisis dynamics in a multipolar, interdependent world where states exercise deterrence across multiple domains? On the first question of whether we are in a similar situation today as we were in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the answer, in my view, is an unsatisfactory maybe, or both yes and no. No, in the sense that as much as history informs our thinking and guides us as we navigate the present and future, no circumstances are ever going to be the same. And there are distinct differences in the potential nuclear conflicts that we face today and in the future, whether that be the current war in Ukraine or any future conflict on or involving Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, or between India and Pakistan. But the answer is also yes, for a number of reasons. Looking specifically at the war in Ukraine, if Ukrainian military forces, military efforts continue to improve and their forces, say, take Crimea, denying the use of the Sevastopol naval base, which is home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, Moscow may, out of desperation, consider using nuclear weapons. Indeed, only last week did Ukraine's commander-in-chief of the armed forces warn in an article of the threat of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons and the direct involvement of the world's leading countries in a limited nuclear conflict. Managing relations between great powers through the prism of deterrence is dangerous and risky. Unfortunately, we seem to be stuck with it for the time being, so we need to take the necessary steps to avoid nuclear conflict. My second question was, in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, is nuclear disarmament possible? I would like to say yes, but I offer another qualified maybe, depending on how the Ukraine war ends. If the war ends without Russia using nuclear weapons, this maintains the non-use nuclear taboo and shows that these weapon systems are unusable, which may help to limit the desire from other countries to develop or acquire nuclear weapons and incentivize, at the very least, renewed efforts towards arms control. If Russia uses nuclear weapons and breaks the non-use nuclear taboo, this may then cause other countries who want to acquire nuclear weapons capabilities to do so, or for those who possess them to make plans for their more limited use. If President Putin, however, were to use nuclear weapons and suffer dire consequences as a result, this could energize the disarmament movement and deter others from going down that path. My third question was, how do we manage crisis dynamics in a multipolar, interdependent world across different domains? Here, we can still apply lessons learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis, including minimizing risks and conflict during a crisis, being flexible, keeping lines of communication open, and trying to prevent crises, not just manage them. The most important element of cases such as the war in Ukraine, a possible war over Taiwan, with North Korea, or between India and Pakistan, is whether any of these conflicts can remain non-nuclear. I will conclude my response with a quote from Robert McNamara, US Secretary of State for Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis, who, when reflecting on the crisis, said, and I quote, "We've learned two things. First, you cannot manage a crisis, meaning a military confrontation between the two great powers or between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. There's absolutely no way. It is impossible to initiate action and do so with high confidence that you can break the consequences of that action. What we have learned is, and I think this is true of the Soviets as well as ourselves, we cannot control these huge masses, these huge organizations, these military machines, and that this is not because they're not disciplined, not at all. They are highly disciplined. It is simply that we are human, we are fallible, we are a function of misinformation, miscalculation, misjudgment, emotion in periods of crises. I think that's the first one. We cannot manage a crisis with assurance that you can avoid unacceptable consequences. And therefore, the second lesson is you must learn to avoid crises. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shata, for your nice explanation of what is going on. Especially, you have overviewed 4 possible cases where there could be a possible breakout of nuclear use. For example, in Ukraine, Taiwan, Korean Peninsula, and between India and Pakistan. And among them, Ukraine is a special case because it is lively moving right now on the ground. And there was a dramatic movement recently when a counteroffensive by Ukrainian Ukrainian armed forces broke through the Russian line in the east. And, well, the Ukrainian counteroffensive was strikingly successful so far, with some people saying that Russian forces are on the run. Might this be a turning point for the war between Russia and Ukraine, and could drive Russia or its leader to possibly consider the use of nuclear weapons, maybe tactical weapons? This is a question that I have listening from your side. Before 다음으로 넘어가기 전에 여기
And before going to the next presenter and discussant, today we have many distinguished guests and students on the floor. So if time allows, we are going to receive some questions from the floor. So while listening to presentations and discussant remarks, if you have any questions, please hold them, and simultaneous interpretation is being provided throughout the session, so you can ask a question in your mother tongue as well.
second discussant, Senior Advisor John Wolfstar. John?
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. It's great to see you again, and great to be here on Jeju for my first trip. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation, and to the audience for coming. It's really terrific to see so many students here. We're talking about something that happened before I was born. I'm 55. I've studied it now for many years. I know it must seem very remote for you. But sadly, you have to live with many of the same dangers that we have navigated or tried to navigate over our lifetimes, but you have new challenges. And what I'll try to explain is how this old history of black and white photographs is still very relevant to what we have to manage today and moving forward. It's interesting to hear Professor Lee's description of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because it's very similar to, I think, what many of us studied in our coursework in graduate school. We are still asked or forced to read a book by Graham Allison, The Essence of Decision, about the Cuban Missile Crisis and why it should be a model for getting things right in a nuclear crisis. And in fact, the lesson of Graham Allison's book is that the Cuban Missile Crisis is a lesson exactly on what not to do. We look at this event as if it were a success, and obviously the absence of a war in itself is a success, but by almost any definition, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a failure, and it is a failure that we continue to repeat because of the arrogance that we have as human beings and the belief, and this is a message specifically for the students in the room, the belief that there is a room filled with smart people who know everything that's going on and have the tools to successfully manage any crisis that comes their way. And the reality is, you are just as smart as the people that are in that small room making these decisions. That's both good news, because you're smart, but it's bad news because none of us are superheroes. None of us have total and complete knowledge. And none of us can control all of the different possible avenues for a crisis to go bad at exactly the wrong time. And so I'll talk a little bit about how the lessons for the Cuban Missile Crisis are relevant today, because we've seen this play out a number of times. So, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a complete lack by American and Soviet leaders to anticipate that their ongoing military competition and confrontation could lead to a crisis where they would need to engage each other and have some trust or confidence that decisions were being made and could be implemented. It is not as if the Cuban Missile Crisis was the first time that the United States and Soviet Union came into conflict. Throughout the 1950s in Berlin and elsewhere, our troops were in close proximity to each other. We had disputes that had economic, territorial, and military dimensions, and still we did not have a regular process for picking up the phone and having our senior military leaders talk to each other and our senior political leaders talk to each other in a manner that could resolve a crisis when time was of the essence. This was a failure to prepare. This idea that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a conflict out of the blue. The United States tried to invade Cuba in 1961, just the year before. So this was easily anticipatable or anticipated, and yet the leaders did not believe they needed to spend any time on this. If you can see some relevance to the problems we have today, then you've understood the message. Second, there was an assumption of full and complete knowledge. And for this, I'll give you one anecdote. I worked at an organization in the mid-2000s, and we organized in Moscow the viewing of a movie with Kevin Costner called The 13 Days. It was about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We hosted and actually brought Robert McNamara and Ted Sorensen, who was John Kennedy's speechwriter, who wrote, "Ask not what you can do for your country, what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," and brought them to Moscow to meet with some of the former Soviet political and military leaders involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis at the time. So this is 40 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, at which they discovered this whole crisis was designed to prevent the Soviet Union from bringing nuclear weapons to Cuba. But they met with a submarine commander who informed them that he was in the Caribbean with nuclear-armed torpedoes on his submarine and had authority to fire them if he was fired upon. So Robert McNamara at the time, 40 years later, still didn't know this. And one of the reasons, I'm sorry that Mariana Bruggerin is not with us, she has done her research looking at the Soviet archives in Ukraine and in Moscow and learning all of the things that even now most leaders don't know about what happened 60 years ago. So it's not even that just complete knowledge is not possible, but even after the fact, you don't know everything that happened. And then thirdly, the reality is that we can't control all of the circumstances. We're not the only actors. One of the things I've worried about the most during recent crises, both the 1993-94 crisis in North Korea, where the United States considered military action, and in 2017, where Donald Trump was actively considering preemptive military strikes on North Korea, is that in that environment, there is the ability to influence global affairs by third countries and by subnational groups, people engaged in disinformation, in ways that can spark a crisis after one develops. In 1962, you could argue, well, the United States and Soviet Union were the main actors, and that's true, and thank God Twitter and TikTok did not exist during those days. But imagine a crisis today where things are quickly spreading faster than the truth. And you see this today, people are very eager to share videos and reports of what's happening in Ukraine faster than they can verify it. And we're all guilty, if we're on social media, of retweeting or liking something and then thinking, do I know that for sure? The Russians are trying to provide misinformation to make the Ukrainians look bad. The Ukrainians are trying to provide information to make the Russians look bad. Both are trying to make the Americans look bad. So we don't control all of those circumstances, and we have to be very mindful. And in the end, and I think this will back up both Shata's point and also Professor Lee's point, is that in the end, if you have gotten to the point where you are using your militaries to resolve political, economic, territorial problems, you are already falling into the trap of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That there's a belief that it's okay if we use our militaries because we will be mature enough, we will be sophisticated enough, and we will be smart enough to effectively climb down that very ladder that we climb up. And if history has told us anything, it's that when we have climbed down, it's more realistic to say we've fallen down. And we are lucky not to have been hurt, but every time we climb up the ladder, and every time we fall down, it increases the odds of us injuring ourselves and others beyond recognition. And these are not weapons that we are used to thinking about or understanding. A nuclear weapon is not a large bullet. It's not a large artillery shell. It's not an airplane crashing into a building. These are history-altering weapons. They are beyond human comprehension, thank God, because we have worked to limit their spread, we have worked to limit their testing, and we have effectively managed to prevent their use for over 70 years. But our luck is not permanent, and we have to recognize now that that's the case and prepare for the inevitable crisis, whether that is with North Korea, China, Russia, or whomever. And to me, that gets to Professor Lee's point, which is, yes, it's good to say that our leaders need to be wise, they need to be engaged, but we also recognize that we are living in a world where many of our leaders are not up to that level. And therefore, it's up to others, whether it's in the military, whether it's in civil society, whether it's politicians from different parts of governments, to engage in those dialogues so that there is an avenue for discussion. It's not enough to say, well, Robert Kennedy and Dobrynin can get together at a Chinese restaurant in Washington and solve all their problems. We need to be more sophisticated in our thinking before things get out of control. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Professor Lee mentioned about Godfather, Marlon Brando. And John, you mentioned about Kevin Costner in movie 13 Days. Aside from this Hollywood movies, I think you just pointed out a very important point, which is based upon our common sense, which is, human beings don't know all about the situation they're in, and that's why we cannot control the situation. It is imperfect situation as a whole that we are working and operating and playing all these things. That is the basic of everything. And the leaders and the people should try to be as much reasonable and wise in this limited information and imperfect situation. I think you have pointed out very important thing, and I believe after one round of discussion, Professor Lee might have some point to add on that. Now, the third discussant, Research Director Alec Chung, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kim, and I would like to say thank you to Professor Lee for your wonderful presentation. And it is unfortunate Professor Mariana Bulgarian could not join us from Rome. And I would also like to say thank you to Ms. Shetty and Mr. Wufsau for being part of this session. And well, I was actually going to mention that movie 13 Days because, well, actually Cuban Missile Crisis is one of my favorite topics when I study international relations because, and thanks to that movie, I think I saw it like when I was an undergrad. That was like 17, 18 years ago, and it's still one of my favorite movies. Yeah, thanks to them. I strongly recommend you all see that movie. Yeah. I don't think it's on Netflix. And I don't think it's on Disney Plus, and I don't know any other streaming services, but I really strongly recommend that you see that movie. It was released like 20 years ago, but you'll be able to find it somewhere, I guess. Yeah. So this year marks the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and back then I heard that people didn't really know that the world was on the brink of nuclear war. The world was like figuratively this close from starting a nuclear war. But humanity was fortunate to have avoided such cataclysmic event. And if the US and Soviet leaders weren't able to come to an agreement that nuclear war should be avoided, then I guess a lot of us won't be here today. We won't exist today. And I think back then, 60 years ago, the US and Soviet Union leaders were able to back down and exercise mutual restraint. Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I guess one of the reasons would be because the catastrophic memories of the World War II was still vivid. And JFK and Khrushchev both experienced war, and JFK actually fought in the war as a naval officer, and he got injured. And a lot of generals on both sides also fought in World War II. And well, of course, nuclear deterrence or mutually assured destruction, MAD, also played this role. But I think one of the major factors that affected the leaders of both countries were that they learned the lesson during the war and didn't want any other full-scale war in their lifetimes, especially when nuclear weapons could be involved, unlike the previous wars. Yeah. They were afraid that another war could send humanity back to the Stone Age. Yeah. And US and Soviet leaders witnessed back in August 1945 the power of nuclear weapons, how destructive they can be. Yeah. And well, of course, memories of World War I weren't enough to prevent World War II, but fortunately, the world didn't repeat the same mistake approximately 20 years later. And that led leaders and members of the cabinet to communicate with their counterparts. Yeah. Those in the US communicated with those in Soviet Union, and those in Soviet Union communicated with those in the US, and they were able to communicate and send signals to avoid escalation. And the past experience and memories affected the leaders' decisions and overall state's actions. Just what worries me today is that most leaders are born after the war, or some of them were too young to have memories of World War II. And well, there are some who remember Vietnam War or Gulf War or those two wars in the Middle East, Afghanistan and Iraq. But those were relatively small wars compared to the world wars. So my concern is whether today's leaders, when they become desperate for some reason, would, although they will hesitate for a moment, in the end decide to use nuclear weapons for their survival or to protect their reputation. Yeah. So for instance, would North Korea decided rather to use it than lose it, yeah, when its regime survival is at stake? Yeah. Or would Putin rather decide to use nuclear weapons rather than failing to win the war, which would destroy his reputation within Russia and around the world? Yeah. So not winning the war and retreating the troops from Ukraine might be the last thing Putin wants to see. Yeah. We are unsure whether he could live with the embarrassment and humiliation he suffers. And you all know that I'm not the only one saying this. Most recently, I saw on the Bloomberg interview, the former US Defense Secretary Leon Panetta also said that Putin might decide to use nuclear war rather than accepting defeat or withdrawal of his troops from Ukraine. Yeah. So Putin might be unable to bear the situation and decide to win the war using any means necessary. And well, although he isn't showing any concrete signs of using nuclear weapons yet, since the early stage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yeah. So on the other hand, my question is whether those completely new generations of leaders are ready and prepared, especially those leaders in democracies. Yeah. Leaders in the past had experience with crisis, yeah, but these new generations of leaders, those who were born after World War II, I'm not saying they are incompetent, but they also don't have any experiences of dealing with such urgent and imminent situations, and in the end, yeah, they might choose the path of another Munich moment. So, for instance, could Biden act like JF Kennedy, not Neville Chamberlain? Yeah. And such an appeasement approaches could further encourage nuclear states to act more aggressively, aggravating the crisis. That is one of my concerns. Yeah. So, besides, recently a lot of nuclear states are trying to move forward and develop tactical nuclear weapons, deliberately reducing explosive yield and targeting smaller targets. And ironically, a lot of experts worry that being less destructive could actually increase the chances of someone using nuclear weapons, because there will be less casualties than using more destructive nuclear bombs. Yeah. And another issue I want to talk about is, another factor that prevented the global leaders from using nuclear weapons would be the nuclear taboo, a normative inhibition against the first use of nuclear weapons. Nobody, or no state, wants to break the tradition of not using nuclear weapons. Nobody or no state wants their reputation damaged by using inhumane weapons. So that's one of the reasons the US didn't use nuclear weapons during the Korean War and even during the Vietnam War, which it eventually failed to win, but it didn't use nuclear weapons. So, however, whether nuclear taboo will still apply to tactical nuclear weapons that are known to be less destructive than other typical long-range, high-explosive nuclear weapons is yet to be known. And besides, we witnessed Russia attacking Zaporizhia nuclear power plant recently. So, instead of using nuclear weapons, attacking the nuclear plant in your opponent's territory might have become one of the options one state could use against the other, facilitating a radiation leak. And that would be one way of states trying to avoid breaking the nuclear taboo while inflicting damage to their opponents. And we just have to hope other states won't emulate this strategy. Yeah. So overall, I do not think I'll see someone using nuclear weapons during my lifetime, but it seems the possibility of someone or a state using nuclear weapons is increasing more and more, and people are forgetting lessons from history because the generation that experienced the World War is disappearing now, and nuclear weapons technologies are developing rapidly. Yeah. And emergence of tactical nuclear weapons could lower the threshold for nuclear use. And also attacking the opponent's nuclear power plant could be, we don't know how destructive it could be because we don't have any precedent yet, but it could be one of the alternatives of using nuclear weapons. And and what's more disturbing is that regional tensions involving a nuclear power is increasing recently between China and Taiwan and Russia in Ukraine and the inter-Korean relations. That's increasing the chances that things might spiral out of control and escalate the already dangerous situation. So to conclude, my two concerns are whether the advent of tactical nuclear weapons will break the nuclear taboo that existed for more than 7 decades, and whether inexperienced leaders, especially in democracies, whether they'll be able to manage the crisis when it occurs without escalating it. So, well, it's better to avoid all the crises, but if we have to choose, then can we rather repeat the Cuban Missile Crisis instead of Munich or someone actually breaking the nuclear taboo? Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alec, for your nice comment. And we have heard 3 excellent comments, and I'll give you an opportunity to Professor Lee Geun-wook to respond for these 3 comments.
Okay, thanks for the wonderful comments all again. And personally, I don't want to be the single guy who would be the crucified, but unfortunately, I'm the guy. Hey, I have a lot of questions, a lot of the feedbacks and the good suggestions and the comment, but I'd like to respond to the 3 of them. The first thing is, as Shatabi says, that the Roth McNamara actually she quoted Roth McNamara said, we cannot manage the crisis thing. And also, the John mentioned that as Graham Allison described the Cuban Missile Crisis, he needs a masterpiece, the essence of a decision. Cuban Missile Crisis would be a kind of a success story, but in some ways it's a failure story. And one of the reasons that it could be categorized as a failure is United States and the Soviet Union did not break the full firm control over the situation. And both of them made the same point, and I agree with them, but this is a kind of irony of deterrence. As I said, deterrence is all about uncertainty. The core, the essence of deterrence is the threat that leaves something to chance. This is all about the chance. We cannot trust our credibility. We cannot be sure, 100% sure that our allies, even ourselves, will honor what we have said in previous occasions. So the very uncertainty is the thing that we should be scared. Simply because we cannot manage the crisis, that is why deterrences work. Even though we believe that we have a firm control of everything, some things slip between our fingers. The very danger, the very risk, the very kind of a possibility that things would go out of control, all of these dangers work to deter everybody. Deterrence is not just about the punishment, the retaliation, the preemption. It's all about the uncertainty. That's my first point. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a success story because luckily we survived. But in 1914, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, the world failed. That is why 10 million soldiers were killed on the battlefield 100 years ago, or actually 110 years ago, 108 to think. The second issue that I'd like to say is this. As John said, that we need the communication channels. Yes, that's true. And the Twitters kind of provide the misinformations and the false news all over the places. That's true. But the leaders should be very prudent, very cautious in using their SNS. One of the former presidents of one of the great powers all over the world had been very notorious behavior in using his Twitter account. One of my friends had made a joke like this. Okay, why the world survived in 1962? Because JFK and Khrushchev did not have any Twitter. All of these Twitters and communication channels would work in a good way and a bad way at the same time. So these things are kind of the tools, but how to use these tools in a more effective ways, effective way is the most important issue. The last issue that I'd like to address is raised by Alex John. He said that it's about kind of a generation gap. Yes, probably it is. However, this argument cannot explain the outbreak of the Second World War. All the major decision makers in the 1939 were the veterans of the First World War. They saw the war, they saw that, they saw the tragedy on the kind of trench warfare, but they choose to fight a war. One other kind of interesting point by Alex is the relationship between the nuclear taboo on the one hand and kind of a technical advancement in the tactical nuclear warhead. This is a very important question in my opinion, but more interesting question is, actually one of my students in the graduate school is writing a thesis over this issue is a kind of effect of nuclear taboo depending upon the regime type. Most of the researches about nuclear taboo are conducted about kind of American decision-making process, basically democracy. Do we expect the effect of nuclear taboo in non-democracies? For example, China, Soviet Union, and Russia, North Korea, Pakistan. All of these countries are nuclear armed and non-democracy. Okay, tactical nuclear weapon might weaken and undermine the effect of a nuclear taboo. But what is more concerned, what I'm concerned more is the very fact that we means the democracies are faced with challenged by revisionist authoritarian regimes. Because they are authoritarians, they are rarely restrained by nuclear taboo, in my opinion. So maybe I'm not answering to your question, but instead I'm just presenting another question. But this is a kind of a topic that we have to think. Because the Republic of Korea is faced with non-democracy, authoritarian, and the nuclear-armed arch-enemy in the north. Okay, let me stop here.
Well, thank you, Professor Lee. I appreciate your response to the comments. As promised, I'll open the floor for a short time. 여기 학생들 와 계시고.
Since we have so many students in the floor, do you have any question from the floor? You can ask any simple question. Please raise up your hands if you have any question. Okay, you are not a student, probably. Please ask a question and please limit the question to just 1 minute, concisely, or you can direct your question to a specific person. You can take up your mask when you ask a question.
For clear communication, propose.
Korea is a democratic country. Democratic countries elect the leader with election. If you see the background of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the memory of the Second World War kind of deterred the Cuban Missile Crisis, some said. But like I said, in a democratic country, leaders are elected. So the capability and competency of the leader is equal to the capability of the voters. So the memories of the leaders, if we want to elect a leader with the memories of the past war, the population need to have that kind of memory in the first place so that they can make a right voting. So the generation after the Second World War really have a weak memory of the past war, where they didn't have any experience. So we are very concerned whether we can overcome the current crisis. If that's the case, where do we need to learn the past memory, the population of today, where do we need to learn those memories? Thank you so much for your question. And maybe
안 했나?
it is being translated, actually, the moderator.
Well, okay. Who will answer? 1 minute.
네.
Go ahead.
Okay. Is it being translated? Can you hear? Okay, great. This is a hard one. And it depends on which country you're talking about. My understanding is that the history of the Korean War is still something that's very well understood here in South Korea, both because of the population that lived through it and the difficult period afterwards. And my hope is that it's something that is still taught very directly in schools. But the question in my mind is not how do we get each country to understand its own history, but how do we translate that history from one country to another? So for me, the most interesting example here is what's happening in Ukraine. The response of the people of Poland to having several million Ukrainian refugees in Poland has been remarkable. They have been welcomed and supported instead of being treated as invaders or a problem. And it suggests to me that, in fact, that history is something that can be transferred from population to population, especially in a global community where you now have access to that information. The people in Eastern Europe have access to information from what's happening in Afghanistan or Yemen. But you put your finger on a problem, which is that nuclear weapons are not very democratic weapons. Once you put nuclear weapons in the hand of anybody, whether they are elected or whether they are an authoritarian, they can use them without any accountability to the people. As opposed to other forms of military power, which do have to go through, in many countries, a declaration of war, a chain of command that is controlled by law. That's clearly not the case in Russia. It's clearly not the case in North Korea. But in a country like South Korea and the United States, that matters. And so nuclear weapons are in this very different category. And one of the issues we work on a lot is whether there should be more controls over nuclear weapons because they are, by their nature, undemocratic. But it is a hard challenge.
Well, thank you, John, for your response. We're running out of time. So if you have further questions, you can approach the panelists after the session is over. As a moderator, I have to wrap up this session. We have gone through the history in general, the specific cases which is going on in the world affairs right now. As a Korean, we're especially concerned about the nuclear situation in Korean Peninsula. and John expressed the specific concern over the Ukrainian situation right there. Professor Lee mentioned depicts the North Korea as a small worm being trodden on, and I'm afraid Kim Jong-un doesn't think so. He strongly maybe refused to be treated as the being trodden worms. Instead, there's a word in Asia, 당랑거철, mantis, in square defiance of approaching wagon wheel. I think Kim Jong-un feels it that way. Well, international relations are as fragile, distraught, uncertain, and fraught as at any time in recent history. Our distinguished panelists showed us their evaluation and into what is going on in this world and gave very valuable wisdom to deal with it. Mark Twain used to say that history does not repeat itself per se, but it rhymes. Humanity should learn the right lessons and recover the collective wisdom and reason from the rhythm of history. As I learn from this session, we have to avoid escalation through self-restraint and intensifying communication as well. But it is very difficult to expect the warring parties for the mutual accommodation. But we have a collective wisdom, humanity, trying to avoid the calamities and the horrible situation as much as possible. I thank you to all the participants, and this concludes our session. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for such remarkable talks. Then, this concludes our session. Thank you for participating in this time. I would also like to thank the moderator who led the session, and the speakers and discussant who filled the session with good opinions and words. Thank you.